Hi, hello. This is the commentary for my Hotline Miami 2 level games. And let's get on with it. So, games is made up of three layers, which essentially act as separate levels. The first level unveils a mobster operation with a few arcade machines in the mix, keeping the theme of games. The second level is more posh in its environment, showing the upper echelons of the mafia. It unveils a casino and a hidden gambling operation that goes on. And the third level takes place in a rooftop with some added rain pouring down just for some dramatic effect while killing enemies. So, Hotline Miami is a game where you essentially just clear floors, clear enemies, and move on to the next stage. There really is no other agenda other than just taking out enemies, so that keeps the objective of the game extremely simple. There are times where narratively the game would ask you to go fetch something, but as far as my level goes, you just clear rooms and move on to the next room. So, when it comes to designing a Hotline Miami level, there are many things you have to consider. There are environmental objects which can have a huge play in the level, enemy placements, and the weapons you provide to the player. All of these play a huge factor when it comes to designing a Hotline Miami level, as it can trivialize a level or just completely break it. Either make it insanely difficult or too easy. I will now go over the elements of what makes a Hotline Miami level a Hotline Miami level. The first thing I will go through are windows and doors, as environment plays a huge factor in Hotline Miami. So in Hotline Miami, you have windows. Essentially, enemies can see through windows. The player can see through windows as well, and both you and the enemy can shoot each other through windows. These can break as well and create noise, causing the enemy to go fetch you. Windows are quite scary in a Hotline Miami level, as essentially it gives an extra line of sight to the player and the enemy as well. In a game where it's everything is mostly one shot, one kill, and the player doesn't really have that much time to sort of evade bullets and fight back, which shows the forgiveness of this game. So windows act as a sort of surprise element in the game. They're there to catch the player off guard and keep the player on his toes and wary of his surroundings. It plays a huge factor when it comes to increasing the difficulty of the game, since the player can get quite comfortable in abusing angles and hardcover walls. Windows also separate the player and the enemy. An enemy can't go through a window, and a player can't go through the window as well, causing an intense fight between the player and the enemy. Doors in Hotline Miami act as a semi hardcover. I say semi hardcover because you can open a door and shoot, though they cannot be shot through, and this goes for both you, the player, and the enemy. Doors can be opened, and you can knock enemies while opening the door if they stand behind it or away from it. Even when an enemy is walking towards you, you can sort of bash the door and knock an enemy. And this plays into many ways the player can choose to tackle a room. They can wait for an enemy to come by a door and open it. They can just open the door, go guns blazing, or they can bait enemies toward the door and open it to knock enemies over. It opens a huge variety of plays the enemy can make with the door. And yeah, those are the functions of the environment. I will now move on to the enemies. So the enemies I've selected for my level are the Russian mob available in the game. There are three types of mobsters. There is the normal mobster, the ones in the white suit. They have weapons like shotguns, ARs, pistols. They're the dogs, and the fat mobsters. I will now go over what each mobster can do. So the normal mobster has multiple variants. They can stay static until the player is seen to move around the map and shoot at the player. They can patrol in 80-degree angles. They can randomly move around the map, or they can stay idle. These behaviors translate to enemies with weapons and enemies with melee weapons. The fat mobster just patrols around the map in 80-degree angles. They cannot be killed by melee weapons and they can only be shot at, while the dogs can't be meleeed with fists but can be shot and killed with melee weapons. Hotline Miami is a game in where enemy placements and enemy variety can make or break a level, and this is a topic I'll touch on later in the level while explaining the maps, as enemy paths and enemy behavior can change the way a level is supposed to be paced out or cleared. I will now go over each floor, its design philosophies, and what makes games games. So the level starts off in a rainy night, which sets in the mood and atmosphere for the level, with thunderstorms crackling around the background and the players going in and clearing enemies. I thought it added for some great dramatic effect. And yeah, as the player walks in through the level, he encounters a bottle and an enemy at the window. This enemy at the window is there for the player to keep getting killed by. It's so that the player learns to tackle the enemy. And how does the player tackle the enemy? Well, he picks his bottle up and he throws it at the enemy. And until the player learns that, the player essentially won't progress through the level or this section easier. The player has the option to go to the enemy and melee him, but it is easier for the player to throw the bottle at the enemy and kill the enemy. This also makes the player learn that the ability that this character has is lethal throws, and he can kill and insta kill any enemy when he throws an object at that certain enemy. This ability doesn't affect fat guys and dogs, though it does affect the mobsters. I essentially place it there so that the player learns this ability first and foremost, as it sort of trivializes the level a bit and makes the level a bit easier. And yeah, so the player walks along, he throws a bottle, kills the enemy at the window, goes in the toilet, takes out the enemy there, and proceeds to encounter the first room. So each enemy is placed with a purpose in hand, and it is to get the player to act a certain way. You have an enemy with a shotgun, an enemy with a wrench by the doorway, an enemy walking along an 80-degree path, and a few idle enemies. So what Hotline Miami essentially breaks down to is a puzzle game, and each room is a puzzle to be solved, and each room has a catered experience to it, and there's a way the player can beat the room, though the player can get a bit creative. So I wouldn't say it's 100% a puzzle game. With this in mind, these enemies are placed for the player to learn and keep dying and to eventually solve the issue that the room has and the problem at hand. The player can open the door, take out the first enemy with the shotgun by throwing an object, as the player had learned previously, killing the enemy at the window. The player can open the door and bait all enemies towards the player to take them all out. So really, there are many ways a player can tackle a room, depending on the room situation. So, as a player clears the room with whatever method he chooses, the player is then faced with a few enemies at the glass to essentially catch the player off guard. In Hotline Miami, I feel that when the player gets too safe and too comfortable, it makes the level a bit boring. The player should die and get surprised, not too much to the point where it becomes frustrating. You should keep the player constantly surprised. No Hotline Miami level should flow perfectly. It needs to have its imperfections and keep the player on his toes 24/7. So after the player decides to tackle the enemies in the room to the left by throwing an object or killing them, there's another enemy to the right for the player to take out. There's also a dog placed in the level if the player gets too comfortable hiding in a corner, just to keep the player on his toes. As the player moves forward, he can again get surprised by the enemy at the top right, constantly rotating and checking the windows. This enemy can snipe the player and catch him off guard. But there is also a forgiveness mechanic for the player over here, right at this wall, for the player to sort of camp out and snipe out enemies. So this wall acts as a breathing space for the player to plan and recuperate their next move. It is also an obstruction for the enemy's LOS on the player. You'll see many of these walls used throughout the level, as they play a huge factor in balancing Hotline Miami's levels. The second layer shows the upper echelons of the mafia and unveils a gambling operation. You can see a casino, you can see enemies with dead bodies over here. It essentially shows some shady dealings going on, and you sort of get a gist of the level's narrative. As the player starts here, he can open the door and kill this enemy. There's an enemy walking up towards the door, so if the player is a bit patient, he can get two enemies at once. Enemy placements also have to do with the guns they have. So essentially, the enemies that walk up here have a shotgun, and fat mobsters can only be killed by weapons. So I've placed certain enemies with certain weapons for the player to take out other enemies with. The reason I've placed an enemy with a shotgun here is a fat mobster comes later on, and the player has something to use to take out the fat mobster. In Hotline Miami, you can take a weapon with you anywhere you go, even with any level you go, but there are some cases where the player would choose to take a melee weapon, or might choose not to take any weapon at all, or might even forget to take a weapon. So placing these enemies are essential for the level to be balanced, so that the player has something to tackle these enemies with. As the player moves along the casino, there's another window to catch the player off guard with. The player can throw his weapon at the enemy or take him out with by just shooting at him. That enemy in particular drops any weapon in the game. This is done as the player can run out of ammo with the double barrel shotguns at the back. The double barrel shotguns only have 2 ammo, and more ammo is needed to take out the other enemies at the front. Encountering the other rooms ahead is quite brutal with just a melee weapon. So I thought that giving the player a bit of a forgiveness and allowing the player to use a ranged weapon to encounter the rooms ahead was vital. Testing this level multiple times made me realize that you need to give the player a bunch of opportunities to play make. These opportunities could include giving certain weapons to tackle certain aspects of the map, and it is really needed in a game like Hotline Miami where things can get really brutal if you don't have the certain gun or melee weapon or certain ability to tackle the level with. The last act of the level takes place at the rooftop of the Russian hideout. Just thought it'd be really dramatic and it gave a finale feel to the level. So as the level starts, the player ends up at this wall right here, and this wall initiates a last stand act where a bunch of enemies come up to that wall and try to take out the player. The player is forced to look left and right and take out enemies in both of the directions, and this really increases the pace of the level and makes things really intense for the player, as the player is not only reliant on reaction time but has to be really reliant on his surroundings. As the player chooses to kill enemies left and right, the player will notice that shooting doesn't really work, since shooting attracts a lot of enemies and even more enemies come to the wall, eventually overwhelming the player. So Hotline Miami also has melee weapons, and melee weapons can allow the player to tackle the level silently as they don't cause sound. So the first enemy that comes up to the wall I have placed purposefully is the enemy with the knife. Every time the level starts, the enemy with the knife comes up to the player first. This is to give the player a hint that you can take out this enemy and you can take the knife and clear out enemies. As the player uses the knife, he can clear out enemies in the level, and lesser enemies will come since the player is making less sound. The player has 2 options. He can either kill more enemies at the wall, or he can move left or right. The player can't move at the middle since the boxes in the level with windows force the player to move either left or right direction, since the player will just be taken out immediately if he moves to the middle. In the gameplay shown here, he moves to the left, takes out a bunch of enemies, and encounters a fat guy. I've purposely placed the enemy with a shotgun at the top left to take out the fat guy with. The player can then move outside through the top door or the bottom door. Either way, the objective after this is to snipe the enemies in the box rooms, and the player can do this by obtaining a weapon from the back and sniping these enemies. Though the player has to be careful in how you angle yourself, since different box rooms have different angles on the windows. So this is sort of a tricky situation for the player, and the player can get sniped from any of these directions. This lowers the pace of the level from the opening act, which was extremely fast paced. I didn't want my levels to feel constantly one pace, as I feel it would make the level boring. Having a change of pace is good for the player, as there is a breathing space and the player can think and choose how to approach the level. Since this level overall is big in design, you do need a lot of thinking spaces for the player, since the player can get shot from anywhere and the player has to go back at the start, and I find that to be incredibly punishing. So having breathing spaces and moments of lower pace where the player can just chill and snipe is a good thing for this level. The player can then clear out all the enemies at the box rooms and proceed to take out enemies on the top right, however way they wish, since all the obstructions have been cleared, and player can scavenge weapons and just go all out in guns blazing. So, in conclusion, Games is a level themed around the Russian mob in Hotline Miami. This theme is kept throughout the level, with each floor containing a game of sort. When it comes to enemies, each placement has a purpose in the way the level unfolds, from fast-paced gunfights to methodical approaches. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening. This is Games.